You need to hear this one, because the Rangers who worked this case still won't talk about it on the record. In June of 2018, deep in the Appalachian Mountains along the North Carolina-Tennessee line, 5 experienced hikers vanished from the same 4-mile stretch of the Appalachian Trail, all within 9 days of each other. Search and rescue crews found their campsites completely untouched. Food still zipped inside the bear bags. Boots lined up outside the tents like the hikers meant to come right back for them. The official file calls it undetermined. The men who worked that search call it something else. Quietly, and only off the record. On the 3rd search, one team found bare footprints leading away from an empty tent, straight up a granite face with a 70-degree pitch. No gear, no blood, no drag marks. The prints just stopped, 80 feet up at a ledge with nothing above it but smooth rock. By the time the searches were called off, 2 hikers were confirmed dead, 3 were never found, and the agency spent the next 6 years trying to keep that file sealed. The man who ran 2 of those searches has never told this story publicly, until now. His name is Dallas Sherrill, and this happened on his watch. Dallas Sherrill was forklift certified from a job he quit back in 2009, and he still kept his old SAR radio charger plugged into an outlet in his cousin's transmission shop out of habit. He hadn't taken his boots above 3,000 feet since the summer he stopped running searches. Tuesday, like every Tuesday, he was under a Freightliner with a torque wrench, and the shop smelled like brake cleaner and old coffee. 15 years running search and rescue out of Johnson County teaches you exactly what a K9 alert sounds like. It also teaches you what it feels like when a scene is too orderly to be an accident, when the ground looks arranged instead of disturbed. Dallas had that feeling more than once. Most of those times he'd found somebody. This next part is the one time he didn't. He'd quit taking calls a long time back. He never got rid of the filing cabinet, though. One folder in it was thicker than the rest. June 2018, 4 miles of trail near the state line, 5 names on the tab in his own handwriting. Everybody in SAR knows the number 72. 72 hours, and a search quietly shifts from rescue to recovery. Nobody says that number out loud in front of family. Dallas had found people alive past it before, twice, which was exactly why the number stopped comforting him. It was the 4th search, the one where 72 ran out and kept running, that he still hadn't managed to put back in that folder. The shop radio crackled on the shelf, and Dallas didn't look up right away. He pulled the folder out of the 2nd drawer. Hadn't opened it in 3 years. Some nights that felt less like avoidance and more like an agreement he'd made with something he didn't have a name for. Right there on the cover, in red marker gone rust-brown with age, somebody, maybe him, had circled one stretch of trail. Dallas had learned a long time ago that the red ink on a topo map didn't tell you how many people went missing there. It told you how many the map still seemed to want back. He flipped to the 3rd witness statement. Got as far as a name, Colton Riggs, before he closed the folder. The way you close a wound you already know needs stitches you're not ready for tonight. Day 3 of the search, Dallas's team reached Colton Riggs's site expecting the standard bad news: hypothermia, a fall, a body within a quarter mile. The tent told a different story. A faded orange 3-season 2-man, duct tape patching the rainfly, a carabiner clipped to the loop where a headlamp should have hung and didn't. Food was still zipped inside the bear bag. Boots were lined up outside the flap like Riggs meant to walk right back into them in 5 minutes. Dallas crouched by the fire ring and caught the smell before he understood it. Something sharp and green, out of place against the char and old rain. Fresh sap, in a spot that hadn't seen a chainsaw in years. He followed the smell to the first tree ringing the campsite and stopped walking. A band of bark had been peeled clean away, straight around the trunk, no ragged edges, no claw gouges, nothing an axe could have made. He checked the next tree. Same band, same height. By the time he'd circled the site, he'd counted 11 trees, everyone stripped the same way, on a slope where the ground itself wasn't level. His team leader ran a tape measure on 3 of the trunks out of pure disbelief. 7 feet 2 inches off the ground. First tree, second tree, third tree. The sap was still weeping down the bark, and it smelled like the trees had been opened an hour ago. Not however many days Riggs had been gone. Nobody on the team said the word out loud. Every one of them was thinking it. There wasn't a version of animal that stripped bark to a tape measure height, 11 times without a single mistake. They widened the grid. 20 yards off the tent, a younger volunteer called out, and Dallas came around a stand of rhododendron to find the second thing that made even less sense than the first. Barefoot prints, a size 10 by the look of the stride, led away from the campsite in a straight line toward a wall of granite that rose out of the slope at close to a 70-degree pitch. No gear marks dragging beside them, no blood. No sign Riggs had stumbled or slid or caught himself. The prints just kept going, evenly spaced, right up onto the rock face, like walking straight up stone was something a barefoot man could simply decide to do. Dallas climbed as far as the scree let him and looked up. The prints ran another 80 feet above where he stood, then stopped. Not faded, not lost in loose gravel. Stopped at a narrow ledge, above which there was nothing but smooth rock, with no visible way up or down. Bolted into the granite near the base of the ledge was a rusted metal disc, the kind surveyors used to mark a benchmark decades back. Dallas noted it the way you'd note a no trespassing sign nailed to a fence post. The Forest Service had these bolted into rock all over these mountains, and moved on without reading whatever was stamped into the metal. Every searcher who'd worked a missing hiker case walked in with a theory about the first 24 hours. Nobody on that slope had a theory for stripped bark measuring out to the exact same height on 11 separate trees. That was the moment, Dallas would say later. The search stopped being about finding Colton Riggs and turned into something else. A search for whatever they were actually standing in the middle of. The tape measure clicked shut in the team leader's hand, and nobody moved. Wind pushed through the tree line, and then didn't, and the sap kept weeping down 11 identical bands of raw wood, like the trees were still bleeding from something that had happened only moments before anyone arrived to see it. Dallas climbed back down off the scree, boots sliding on wet rock the last few feet, and radioed in a location he didn't yet have a way to explain. Some details you write down exactly as you found them, because trying to make sense of them on the spot only gets in the way. A survey marker holding its ground 80 feet below footprints that simply stopped existing was one of those details. He'd worry about the rest later. 6 years later, Dallas found Everett Pruitt in a diner in Irwin, the kind of place with a bell over the door and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. Everett had run rangers on that mountain for 3 decades before he retired, and Dallas had been trying to get him talking, off the record, for the better part of a year. The bell rang when Dallas walked in. Everett was already in a booth by the window, hands flat on the table like he'd been waiting on something he didn't want to arrive. Dallas slid in across from him and didn't waste time. He asked about the 6 names. Everett didn't answer right away. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, then another quarter turn, and finally reached into a bag beside him and slid a folder across the formica. 6 names, 1962 to 2005. Every one of them logged the same way in the file, transferred. "We didn't stop looking," Everett said. "We stopped telling people we were looking, because every time we went back in, one of us didn't come out." Dallas opened the folder, 6 dates, and in the margin of every single file, in 6 different sets of handwriting spanning over 40 years, somebody had circled the same number, 72 hours. First entry to last radio contact every time without exception. Everett had 30 years on that mountain, and in all that time, he'd never once used the word recovered about any of the 6 men in that folder. Either he didn't know what had happened to them, or he knew exactly what had happened and the word simply didn't apply anymore. Cold air came through the door every time somebody new walked in, and it carried a smell that didn't belong to Irwin at all. Pine and whetstone, ridge air, the kind that comes down off a mountain and settles into a diner 2 miles from the trailhead like it had followed somebody in. Dallas pushed the folder back toward Everett and told him he was going to file a FOIA request. Get everything the agency had on that stretch of trail, official record or not. Everett's hand came down flat on top of the folder before Dallas could close it. "Don't," he said. "Whatever's on that ledge has never once been worth what it costs to find out." Dallas had walked into that diner, expecting an argument he could win. What he got instead was a man who agreed with every fact Dallas had laid out and still believed filing that request was the worst decision Dallas would ever make. Everett wasn't the type of man who was often wrong about things like that. "You've spent 30 years not asking," Dallas said. "I've spent 6 not sleeping." Everett didn't have an answer for that one. He just folded his hands the way a man does when he's finished talking, even though something in his face said he wasn't. The coffee between them had gone cold, and neither man had touched it in a while. Dallas noticed his own hand was resting flat on the table now too, mirroring Everett's, like the posture had crawled across the booth without either of them deciding it should. He stood up, folder in hand, keys already out of his pocket. Everett's voice caught him halfway to the door, low enough that Dallas almost missed it under the bell. "Don't," he said again. Dallas didn't turn around. He pushed through the door, and the cold air hit him the same way it had every time it swung open, like it had traveled 2 miles down off that ridge just to reach him, carrying something that smelled less like weather and more like a warning nobody at that mountain had ever managed to write down properly. He got in his truck, set the folder on the passenger seat, and by the time he pulled out of the lot, he'd already decided he wasn't going to listen. Some part of him understood, even then, that this was the kind of decision a person only got to make once, and that Everett, sitting alone in that booth with his coffee going cold, had just watched him make it. The FOIA response came back 3 months later, a stack of pages so heavily redacted that most of them were just black bars from margin to margin. Dallas went through every single one anyway, because that was the kind of thing 15 years of search and rescue trained into a person. You read the whole file, even when you already know most of it is going to be blank. He almost missed the line. It wasn't typed like the rest of the document. It was handwritten, cramped, pressed hard enough into the paper that he could feel the indent on the back of the page with his thumb. Stop asking. Some trails aren't meant to be mapped. He read it 4 times before he understood it wasn't a suggestion. Buried 3 pages deeper, in a work order nobody had bothered to redact, was a line item for a demolition contractor. Slope stabilization, scheduled for that exact coordinate, 72 hours out from the date stamped at the top of the page. Dallas sat with that number longer than he wanted to admit. He told himself posting the coordinates online was just insurance. If something happened to that ledge, at least somebody besides him would have looked at it first. He didn't call Everett before he did it. He didn't let himself think too hard about the fact that Everett had told him twice in a diner in Irwin not to. 2 weeks after that, a hiking channel with about 40,000 subscribers live-streamed from the coordinates to prove the spot was still there. Dallas watched it from his cousin's shop at 11 at night, sitting on an overturned bucket with a cold cup of coffee going untouched beside a torque wrench. The chat scrolled too fast to read. The kid running the stream had a headlamp that swung wide across the trees every time he turned his head, and his voice had that too loud, too excited pitch of somebody who didn't yet understand what he was standing in front of. The camera crested the last rise toward the granite face, and the rock face wasn't there. Not collapsed, not weathered down, sheared clean off, a raw pale scar against 50 years of dark, wind-worn stone, blast damage still fresh enough that dust was drifting off it in the kid's headlamp beam. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. Dallas could hear the kids breathing, a truck idling somewhere far off on the highway below, his own pulse working in his ears. But there was a stillness under all of it that felt like something had been removed from the world, and the world hadn't finished settling into the gap it left behind. The kid picked his way down into the rubble, camera shaking, narrating half to himself. And there, half buried in broken granite at the base of what used to be the ledge, the headlamp caught metal. The kid crouched down and read the stamp on it out loud for his 40,000 viewers, because he had no idea what he was holding. 1961. Dallas set his coffee down so hard it sloshed over the rim. 1 year before, the first of Everett's 6 rangers ever went missing, and there was no public record of any Forest Service survey on that section of trail before 1974. Dallas had already checked twice back when he still thought that detail mattered less than it turned out to. The blast had answered exactly one question. The ledge was gone. Whatever had been up there was gone with it, presumably, buried under tons of fresh rubble that nobody was ever going to dig through by hand. But it left him with one he couldn't put down. If that rock face had only just been rediscovered by a kid with a phone and 40,000 subscribers, then whoever had bolted that marker into the stone had already been up there 13 years before the first ranger ever failed to come back down. And they'd left something behind to mark the spot on purpose. Dallas looked down at his own workbench without meaning to. There were pencil marks scratched into the edge of it, years old, measurements he didn't remember taking for a job he couldn't remember doing. He ran his thumb along them the way you'd check a wound to see if it still hurt. 7 feet 2 inches, every single one of them. He'd lined them up without ever once deciding to. The shop radio crackled on the shelf behind him, and for the first time in 6 years, Dallas didn't wait to see if it would say anything else. He reached over and turned it off, and the quiet that followed sat in the room with him like it had been waiting its turn. The county closed that stretch of trail within the month, officially for erosion control. The sign at the trailhead was the same green Forest Service sign as every other closure sign in the state. Nothing about it any different. And Dallas figured most people who drove past it would never think about it again. He put the folder back in the second drawer of the filing cabinet. Then he took it back out one more time before he closed the drawer. Same map. Same stretch circled in red gone rust brown with age. Except this time he wasn't looking at it like a question he still planned on answering. He was looking at it the way you look at a scar. Not because you expect it to explain itself, but because some part of you checks on it out of habit. Somebody had spent real money and real explosives to erase 80 feet of a mountain that almost nobody would ever hike. The file never said whether that was done to hide what had been sitting on that ledge or to keep it in. Dallas had turned that over enough nights by now to understand the 2 possibilities asked you to be afraid of 2 completely different things. and he'd stopped trying to decide which one kept him up worse. He drove out to see Colton Riggs's family exactly once, a few months after the live stream, mostly because he felt like he owed them that much after 6 years of keeping a folder they didn't know existed. Riggs's sister answered the door. She still had his hiking boots on a shelf by the entryway, laces still tied the way he'd tied them the last morning he ever wore them, and Dallas noticed the laces were a faded safety orange, the same color he realized later on the drive home, that Johnson County had used decades back to mark trail sections slated for closure. He never brought it up to her. He just noticed it once and found he couldn't unnotice it after that. That evening, back at the shop, Dallas went through his closing routine, same as always. Lights, register. The bay door chain pulled down and locked. His hand landed on the light switch and stayed there half a second longer than it needed to. He didn't ask himself why. He'd learned there wasn't always an answer waiting on the other side of that question, and some nights the not asking was the only thing that let him sleep. He'd told himself for 6 years that he wanted an answer. Standing at that cabinet with the folder back in his hands, he understood now that it had been the not knowing that let him keep sleeping at night in the first place, and that the moment he'd actually gotten close to finding out, he wasn't sure he'd get to keep that particular comfort ever again. Somewhere out past the shop, past the transmission bays and the state road and the dark tree line beyond it, that mountain was still doing the one thing it had always done, long before Dallas Sherrill ever pinned a name to a topo map and long after he'd be gone from it. Measuring everything out exactly. 7 feet, 2 inches, over and over, in places nobody was ever meant to find and measure back. Waiting, the way it had always waited, for somebody else to start counting. Dallas flipped off the last light and locked the door behind him, same as any other Tuesday, and went home.